Hi, thanks for joining me. For those of you new to the channel, my name is Mindy Mandell. Today, what we're going to do is revisit the dialogue Phaedrus. So last week I talked about the main body of the dialogue. Today, what I'm going to do is focus on the last section where Socrates gets into things like rhetoric and speech making and dialectic. If you did not see last week's video, it's okay. You don't need to have seen it in order to understand what I'm going to talk about today, because I'm really switching gears. It's a very different feel to it today. But of course, your life won't be complete until you do watch it. So I'm going to put a link for it up at the top and also in the description box. But okay, so today, as I said, we're going to really switch gears, getting into dialectic. Dialectic feels kind of dry to those Platonists who are really into the more mystical side. However, I would argue that dialectic is a really important tool to have in your tool chest if you want to have those deeper spiritual experiences. So whether you are here as an atheist or agnostic Platonist or as a spiritual Platonist, I think that today's discussion is helpful to all of us. So let's get into it. Okay, we're going to start with rhetoric and speech making because this is where Socrates starts. However, he is eventually going to get into dialectic, and I think by the end of the video, you will have a clear idea of what the difference is between rhetoric and dialectic and how the two fit together. We're also going to see that dialectic is really the art that is key to those of us who are most interested in being philosophers or lovers of wisdom. Here's what he says about rhetoric. He says, I think you will agree to this, that every discourse must be organized to have a middle and members composed in fitting relation to each other and to the whole. And by the way, I just want to make sure I point out that as with last week's video, we're still in the same dialogue, so we're looking at the same translator, Harold North Fowler. Okay, so he is going to go into the same basic structure that I think we all learned as school children. You got to have your introduction, you have your body, the narrative, the testimony, proofs, probabilities, confirmation, all of that in the body, and then you close it off with a conclusion. So that's pretty much what we all learned as school kids. Socrates also goes into some discussion of the tools of rhetoric. And this is really what most of us think of when we think of rhetoric. I'm going to give you an overview. If you want to look at this section, it is a bit lengthy, and you can see it starts from 267a. In that section, he gives not only the tool, but also the sophist who is most directly connected to that particular tool. So we've got a whole list here, like refutation, both in accusation and defense, covert allusion, indirect praise and censure, probabilities treated with more esteem than truth. That's where you get all of your conspiracy theories and whatnot. Duplication, if you say it often enough, people are going to believe it. Terse, pithy expression makes you sound wise. Metaphors and figurative language. Correctness of diction, so you sound intelligent. And of course, emotional language to arouse pity, anger, and so on. So this is what most of us think of when we think of rhetoric. These are the tools of rhetoric, and we think that a person who has mastered these things is a master of rhetoric, knows the art of rhetoric. That is not Socrates' position. He calls these actually the preliminaries. And he gives a number of examples. Here's one of them. He says, if a musician met a man who thought he understood harmony because he could strike the highest and lowest notes, well, being a musician, he would say in gentler tones, my friend, he who is to be a harmonist must know these things you mention, but nothing prevents one who is at your stage of knowledge from being quite ignorant of harmony. Not very gentle, is it? You know the necessary preliminaries of harmony, but not harmony itself. Okay, so these are the preliminaries. So what is the key? What is the main thing that he sees as being key to the art of rhetoric? If a speech is to be good, must not the mind of the speaker know the truth about the matters of which he is to speak? So truth is the key. It's not enough to have those skills. those skills, that list of tools, that's like every politician in every country around the globe. Wherever you're watching this video from, I'm sure that the politicians in your country have mastered those tools of rhetoric. But that does not mean that they're speaking truth or that they're doing any benefits to those who are listening to them. He goes on to say, in contrast, that persuasion comes from what seems to be true, not from the truth. So people like salesmen or women or politicians, they've mastered persuasion. They tell you what seems to be true, and they try to convince you to go one way or another, to buy something from them, to vote for them, whatever it is. But it doesn't mean that they actually know truth. Here are some more things that Socrates says. He says, a real art of speaking, which does not seize hold of truth, does not exist and never will. So to truly have an art of speaking, and I'm going to talk a little more about art very soon, to have this art, you have to seize hold of truth. He says, unless you pay proper attention to philosophy, you will never be able to speak properly about anything. He goes on to say that he who knows not the truth, but pursues opinions, will, it seems, attain an art of speech which is ridiculous and not an art at all. So what most people call the art of speech, that person who has a skillful way of being persuasive and being convincing without caring about truth, that person has a pseudo-art that he calls ridiculous, and it's in reference to this pseudo-art that Socrates later says that he possesses no art of speaking. So that raises the question, what is art? Now, one thing that makes the Phaedrus a difficult dialogue is that Socrates never defines art in this dialogue. He keeps using the word over and over again, assuming that we know what it means. What I did here is I pulled out some quotes from the Republic, because even though Socrates did not define art here, he did define it in the Republic. Now it's going to take a few screens for us to get to the point here, so bear with me. But this comes from the Republic. It's book 1 in the Republic, and these quotes are from the translator Paul Shorey. He says, if you should ask me, and this is Socrates, if you should ask me whether it is enough for the body to be the body, or whether it stands in need of something else, I would reply, by all means it stands in need. That is the reason why the art of medicine has now been invented, because the body is defective, and such defect is unsatisfactory. To provide for this, then, what is advantageous, that is the end for which the art was devised. Okay, so the art exists for the benefit of the body, not for the art of medicine, but not to benefit the medicine itself or the doctor, but to benefit the patient and to benefit the body. He goes on to say, there is no defect or error at all that dwells in any art. That'll become significant in a moment. Nor does it befit an art to seek the advantage of anything else than that of its object. But the art itself is free from all harm and admixture of evil, and is right, so long as each art is precisely and entirely that which it is. So now to wrap up his definition of art, Socrates has this little conversation with his interlocutor Thrasymachus. Then medicine does not consider the advantage of medicine, but the advantage of the body? Yes. Nor does horsemanship consider the advantage of horsemanship, but it considers the advantage of horses. Nor does any other art look out for itself, for it has no need. And I'm just going to momentarily go back here, because remember in the last screen we saw, for there is no defect or error at all that dwells in any art. And so since the art has no deficiency, it has no need to look out for itself. Instead, it looks out for that of which it is the art. And Thrasymachus agrees, so it seems, he says. And so we see here that the key to calling something an art is that it benefits the recipient. So if you're doing dialectic alone, you're turning it inward, you're benefiting your own soul. But if you're in a conversation with somebody else, like Socrates talking to Thrasymachus here, or anyone else he talks with, he wants to benefit that person. And so that's an art. He has the art of rhetoric. So what this means is that the politician or the salesperson who's very slick and persuasive does not have an art, even though the person may be very skillful, because those people are trying to benefit themselves. The salesperson wants you to buy the product. The politician wants you to vote for him or her, or to give a donation or some such thing. So the person is looking out for their own benefit. So Socrates says this is not an art. This is a very strict definition of art and quite different from our common notions of it. We're not talking about the liberal arts. We're not talking about dancing or singing or writing poetry. We're not talking about having any particular skill, whether it's athletic or dancing and so on, or it's that, art or that skill. I did it again. Got to be careful there. See, we use the word art in a very different way in natural speech, and it's easy to slip, so I got to be careful. But it's not that persuasive skill that politicians or salespeople have. So now we have to look at dialectic, because for Socrates, this is the method of getting to truth. And since truth is key to developing that art of rhetoric, we have to know dialectic. And by the way, Socrates does use the phrase art of rhetoric all through this section of the dialogue, even when he's talking about dialectic. So it is helpful to keep that definition of art in mind. It makes the whole dialogue make a lot more sense. All right, so he says, all great arts demand discussion and high speculation about nature. This was in Pericles added to his great natural abilities. For it was, I think, his falling in with Anaxagoras, who was just such a man, that filled him with high thoughts and taught him the nature of mind and of lack of mind, subjects about which Anaxagoras used chiefly to discourse. So Anaxagoras, for those of you who are not familiar with him, was a philosopher who preceded Socrates, and his main teaching was that all is mind. And so what Socrates is saying here is that Pericles, who was a great leader, a politician, fell in with Anaxagoras and he started to learn truth. And it's because of learning truth that his skills as a rhetorician really reached the level of becoming an art. All right, then Socrates has this little talk with Phaedrus. He says, the method of art of healing is much the same as that of rhetoric. How so? In both cases, you must analyze a nature, in one that of the body, and in the other that of the soul, if you are to proceed in a scientific manner. So what we're doing with dialectic is really trying to find a systematic way to understand the nature of reality or some aspect of reality. Okay, here's a rather cumbersome section, but this is really where Socrates is giving us everything, all the steps really of dialectic. It's a little bit cumbersome, as I said, so I'm going to read through it first and then break it down. In considering the nature of anything, must we not consider first whether that in respect to which we wish to be learned ourselves and to make others learned is simple or multiform? And then, if it is simple, inquire what power of acting it possesses and of being acted upon, and by what, and if it has many forms, number them, and then see in the case of each form, as we did in the case of the simple nature, what its nature is and how it is acted upon and by what. Okay, let's break this down. So first off, we see that we can be learned ourselves, which is when we do dialectic on ourselves. And we can also make others learned, like the way Socrates would interact with his various interlocutors. So first, let's focus on the phrase simple or multiform. The early dialogues focus largely on the idea of virtue, and Socrates would ask over and over again, is virtue a one or is it a many? What is that one quality that all virtues have in common? So he's really focusing on this point, trying to get his interlocutor to think in this way. Often he would ask if the various things that we call virtues are actually quite different. Justice and courage are quite different. Do they have a certain quality that would put them together under the umbrella of virtue, or should one of them be broken off? And if so, that's where you get the last part of the phrase of this whole section here. How many forms, number them, and then treat each one as a simple nature. So that goes together with this idea of simple or multiform. So we come up with questions like this. What is something in its purest, simplest sense? That's really the question that we're asking here. In the early dialogues, the main question was, what is virtue? In this dialogue, Socrates asks, what is soul? We can also apply any of the absolute realities. What is beauty? What is goodness? What is rest? What is motion? And so on. We can go through all of them. What is equality? And so on. So you can apply anything. What is the first principle of all? Socrates says this. Now I myself, Phaedrus, am a lover of these processes of division and bringing together, as aids to speech and thought. And if I think any other man is able to see things that can naturally be collected into one and divided into many, him I follow after and walk in his footsteps as if he were a god. And according to a footnote, that is a reference to Homer's Odyssey. Whether the name I give to those who can do this is right or wrong, God knows, but I have called them hitherto dialecticians. So this is a key part of doing dialectic, this dividing and also defining. Once we do this, then we go on to this other section here, which is really looking at how this thing functions. So the power of what power of acting it possesses, or of being acted upon and by what. So we have to look at how it functions, both active and passive. For example, in the case of soul, we might ask, how does soul affect the physical world? We might also then turn that around and ask, how does the physical world affect soul? Those of us who are involved in a wisdom tradition, obviously we want to better ourselves. And if it's a wisdom tradition that teaches that our essence is soul, then it means we want to better the soul. And so there must, we hope anyway, that there's some way the physical world affects the soul. So we need to consider that. We also have to ask, for example, how our interactions with one another, how they're affected in light of soul functioning. So one argument that a lot of agnostics will make is that it really doesn't matter if there's a God or not, or if there's a divine realm or spiritual realm. It doesn't matter because it doesn't affect their lives anyway. That's what they would argue. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but we have to consider that. That's a question we can't overlook. As we get deeper into metaphysics, as we get a better grasp on metaphysics, we can also start asking things like, how is soul affected, or how does it affect the realms beyond it? Or can it affect them? Can it affect the first cause of all? How does the first cause affect soul? And so on. And by the way, dialectic is something we come back to again and again. It's not like a one-time thing and then you're done. We keep coming back, and every time we have more insights, we bring more to our studies, and so it makes it a new study all over again. So we keep coming back to it. All right, so what is the point of this? Well, Socrates says that any other mode of procedure would be like the progress of a blind man. So when you're dealing with realms of thought that are beyond the physical, beyond the tangible, it feels obscure, it feels abstract, and it's hard to even know where to begin. It's easy to get overwhelmed. So what we're doing with dialectic is giving some structure to our thoughts. We're bringing a sense of concreteness to what otherwise feels abstract. He says it's the goal of all his effort. He tries to produce conviction in the soul. And it's not conviction in the sense of persuasion, but conviction in the sense of understanding. He goes on to say that by no other method of exposition or speech will this or anything else ever be written or spoken with real art. So you have to bring truth to your writing or to your speaking in order for it to be an art, a real art. Remember the definition of art that we're using, that Socrates uses, that he introduced in the Republic, is that you have to benefit the object or the recipient of your words, whether they're written or spoken. Now, this is a rather cumbersome sentence, and I checked a few different translations. I'm not fluent in Greek, and so I can't tell you what the Greek is, but it must be a cumbersome sentence even in Greek because every translation of it is messy. But basically what he's saying here is that you have to know your audience, right? So men of a certain sort are easily persuaded by speeches of a certain sort for a certain reason to action or beliefs of a certain sort, and men of another sort cannot be so persuaded. Very messy, very difficult sentence, but I think we can all get the gist of it. You have to know your audience and adjust your words to fit your audience. So the person who is only looking to persuade and is looking out for their own benefit will try to use the tools of rhetoric in a way that is most persuasive, but the person who is interested in truth will do this for the benefit of the recipient. So this is really Socrates. He was able to change his form of argument depending on who he's talking to. Sometimes he took a gentler tone, sometimes he took a harsher tone, and he was able to adjust accordingly depending on who he's speaking with. If he's speaking with somebody like Phaedrus, who is open to his ideas, or if he's talking to somebody like Hippias, who is not. He also says that in addition to knowing how to speak, you also have to know when to keep silence. Now, for those of us who are working with a teacher in a wisdom tradition, we know that silence is really annoying. And I'm speaking from experience here. I work with a teacher who uses silence more than I would like. And I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, it is actually for our own benefit, even though it's really, really annoying when our questions are not answered. The reason it is for our benefit is because we have to find the answers within ourselves. So I did do a video a ways back, I think it's the second video in this series, on all of the dialogues, an overview of the dialogues. The second half of that video, I gave some advice on how to read the dialogues in a way that will give you the most benefit. And one of the points was that we have to hold on to our questions, have to have the courage to admit that we don't know, and to just hold on to that confusion, because that really does work wonders on our soul, and it keeps us curious, and it keeps us working towards finding the answer and keep digging. Because if somebody always just tells you the answer, it's, oh, okay, that's curious, that's interesting, and then you easily forget it. So I talk about that a bit on that video, but that's the same idea here of keeping silence, of knowing when you're saying too much, when you should say more. And then here is a nice summary of basically everything that Socrates said in this section. He says, a man must know the truth about all the particular things of which he speaks or writes, and must be able to define everything separately. Then, when he has defined them, he must know how to divide them by classes until further division is impossible. And in the same way, he must understand the nature of soul. He must find out the class of speech adapted to each nature, and must arrange and adorn his discourse accordingly. So that's knowing your audience. Offering to the complex soul elaborate and harmonious discourses, and simple talks to the simple soul. Until he has attained to all this, he will not be able to speak by the method of art, so far as speech can be controlled by method, either for purposes of instruction or for persuasion. And then he's going to end with pointing out that even if you do master all of this, including the art of dialectic, you wouldn't have the title of rhetorician. That person has just those tools. But if you are truly interested in truth, then that more serious pursuit is what should define your writings. He says, if he has composed his writings with knowledge of the truth, and is able to support them by discussion of that which he has written, and the written words are of little worth, Such a man ought not to derive his title from such writings, but from the serious pursuit which underlies them. And Phaedrus asks, what titles do you grant them then? Socrates says, I think, Phaedrus, that the epithet wise is too great and befits God alone. But the name philosopher, that is, lover of wisdom, or something of the sort, would be more fitting and modest for such a man. Or woman, I want to add that. But what we see here is that this is why Socrates was known as a philosopher and not as a master of rhetoric, even though he did master this. He did know all those tools. And if you read the early part of the dialogue, or if you watched last week's video, you saw that he gave a speech that he did not actually agree with, using many of those tools. Plato also is not known as a rhetorician, even though his writings are very skillful, because he too was more interested in that serious pursuit of philosophy. And so the real point of rhetoric, its real benefit, is to be like Socrates or like Plato, whether you are good at writing or you're good at talking with people. And that it really, I think, depends on if you are more of an extrovert or an introvert. But whatever your means of communicating, if you can communicate truth and help others see it, then you are bringing rhetoric to the level of an art. And so that's the goal of rhetoric. But initially, we have to first find truth. And that's why we focus on dialectic early on. So that brings us to the end of today's video. If you have any questions or comments, as always, I invite you to leave them in the comments section or to send me an email. Also, I greatly appreciate a thumbs up, and please subscribe and share and all of that. Next week, we're going to go on to the dialogue Cratylus. Now, Cratylus is a really interesting dialogue. It's generally treated as a look at the origins of language. And certainly there is a lot of etymology in it, but there's a whole lot more going on. So I do hope you'll join me next week. Thank you so much.